This necessity, however, is the unity of the notion which brings under control the contradictory substantial being of the separate moments, a unity in which the inconsistency and arbitrariness of their action is orderly disposed, and the play of their actions receives its earnestness and worth in the actions themselves. The content of the world of pictorial thought freely unfolds itself in the middle term on its own account, gathering itself round the individuality of a hero who, however, in his strength and beauty, feels his life is broken and sorrowfully awaits an early death. For the individuality that is in itself firmly established and actual is banished to its extreme and split into its moments which have not yet found and united themselves. The one individual moment, the abstract non-actual one, is necessity, which shares in the life of the middle term just as little as does the other, the actual individual, the minstrel, who keeps himself outside of it and is lost in his performance. Both extremes must draw nearer to the content. One of them, necessity, has to fill itself with the content. The other, the language of the minstrel, must participate in it. And the content formerly left to itself must receive within it the certainty and the fixed character of the negative. Paragraph 732 is shorter than the preceding paragraph, which we saw was quite dense, a lot of stuff going on in there, and similarly, there's an awful lot happening in this paragraph. I would say, really, in order to understand it, and this can be said about many paragraphs, I'll go on about this in just a moment, in order to understand this particular paragraph and what Hegel is doing, where the movement is going, we have to look at the previous paragraph because there's going to be some really important contrasts with what was said, for example, about necessity and concepts in that. But we also need to look ahead to the next paragraph, which begins by saying this higher language, that of tragedy. Right? So remember that part of what's going on in this entire section, proceeding from the last subsection where we found out that there's a new kind of language that is going to be more adequate as a vehicle for religion, and it wasn't specified in that particular section or in that paragraph where it was being brought up. Instead, it was being contrasted with the previous forms of language, like that of the frenzied crowd, the oracle, the hymn. Now we're getting these great representative or picture thinking vorstellendes forms of, we can call them art. We often classify them as literature. And with some of them, we teach them not just in literature, but also as drama, so we connect them up with theater, right? And so we're in no longer the living work of art, but now solidly in the spiritual work of art. And we should think about this as bringing in the abstract and the living and now rolling them into something more. In this section, the final section of the second portion of religion, where we're looking at religion in the form of art, we're now talking about several main genres that we typically associate with the Greeks, but which we can find in many other cultures as well. We began with the epic, and now we are making our transition from the epic to drama, to tragedy first, and then to comedy. And in the epic, the minstrel or the bard, the Sänger, is going to be an important, as we've seen, mediating term, a Mitte, a middle between extremes. Hegel likes to think in terms of middle joints. You know, he often uses the language of the syllogism, and he's not using it here, generally in the phenomenology, in the ways that we're used to thinking about syllogisms, where you've got three different terms and they're connected together in propositions. Instead, he's going beyond that and thinking about these as having mediating functions. And, this is a bit of a digression, but it's probably worth pointing out that Aristotle himself, known as like the forger, the producer, the classificatory person for syllogisms, if we look at what are called the logical works, actually has a much broader conception of syllogism that we can see coming up in works like the rhetoric, the art of rhetoric, right? Or even to some degree in the topics, and being used differently in other works. Syllogismos means bringing together, sun, logoi, or discourses, or conceptions of things, and bringing them together in a way that unites them while maintaining distinction between them. And Aristotle talks about human beings, and again, this is in the Rhetoric, particularly Book 3, as being syllogistic, meaning being able to find the middle term. And Hegel himself is a prime example of a thinker who is syllogistic in that sense, not putting things into syllogisms, but rather finding the middle, mediating, uniting term that is going to help us sort through what is going on in these developments. And Hegel himself is trying to make sense out of Greek drama and Greek epic. And in return, we could say Roman and later drama and epic as well. He's trying to do so and think out how this helps us to understand the development of religion. Remember, too, that religion is the next best thing to philosophy for Hegel. And not just philosophy per se, because there's plenty of philosophies that fall short of religion, what he's going to call in, for example, the lectures on the philosophy of religion, philosophies of the understanding as opposed to philosophies of reason. So where we're going in this work, ultimately, absolute knowing, is philosophy per se for Hegel, and religion is like one step below it. And so Greek tragedy, Greek comedy, Greek epic also fits in there, as well as the other parts of Greek religion. So that's a lot said. I do want to follow up on just one other thread before I forget about it that I mentioned. Oftentimes, when we're reading through Hegel and looking at what a particular paragraph has to say, there is a temptation to take that paragraph as if it is the point of view of Hegel. That's always a mistake in the phenomenology, right? The phenomenology is a dynamic work that is following out the development of human consciousness in the parts of it that are developing over time in history through culture, Bildung, and whatever else we want to translate, education, cultivation, all those sorts of things. So, strictly speaking, no one single paragraph should ever be read upon, just by itself in isolation. I understand that in this commentary, we are doing something like that because we've divided up the commentary into portions, and we have to fit them into a certain time frame for explanation. But you should not be reading these as if they are isolated units. Rather, you should be reading a section at a time. Right? I mean, we can say this about other texts as well. If you're reading Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, read the whole friggin' book. And when I say book, I mean basically chapter of the book. The Nicomachean Ethics has 10 books. So if you're going to look at what he has to say about justice in Book 5, read the whole thing. Don't just isolate one little paragraph out. Why not? Because that's a good way to make sure that you're not getting the full meaning of what's going on. Obviously, some paragraphs are going to be more intimately connected with each other than they are to yet other paragraphs. but you do want to keep that interconnection in mind. So in this case, let's start at the start. He's referencing at the very beginning this necessity. What necessity? The necessity that was just talked about in paragraph 731, where what did he tell us about this necessity? Well, this necessity is an irrational void, as Miller has translated it, a mere happening in which they must face as beings without a self and sorrowfully, etc., etc. And what was the actual term there? It's not irrational. It's actually begrifflos, right? And so we have a really important contrast going on here in paragraph 732. Why? Because in the first line he says this necessity is the unity, the Einheit of what? The notion, the begriff, the concept, right? So we're seeing a different side of this necessity. We thought, it's just stupid necessity. It can't even be called fate, as I pointed out in the previous one, because it's just dumb. It's just the way things are. It's like pure facticity, if we want to use later terminology. But no, now we're finding out that this necessity is, in fact, the unity, the Einheit, the bringing together, the connection of the concept that is hidden behind the scenes that we can make sense of. This is going to be a very important point. What does the notion do? It brings under control, literally places under itself. It throws under itself the contradictory, substantial being of what? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let's focus on that for a minute. Again, referencing back to the previous paragraph where Miller was translating, contradiction, and I had pointed out, well, it's really more opposition, in this case, the terminology being based on entgegengesetzt, right? Things that are set in opposition to each other, that are like facing each other and differ from each other and have some sort of relation with each other, right? And we can think about different oppositions. Is black the contradiction of white? No, it's really just the opposite of white. And in a certain respect, gray could be said to be not just a mixture of both, but the opposite of both of those two, mixture, fusion, as opposed to separation, right? And we could go on and on and on with these sort of examples. Here, we're actually talking about contradiction. Widerspruch. Widersprechende, right? Contradictory from Widerspruch. And I pointed out that within Hegel, we have a rich terminology that gets used of contradiction and opposition. Antithesis is often how Miller will translate these terms. And in between the entgegengesetzte, the things that are merely opposed to each other, and the genuine Widerspruch, the contradiction, we also have the Gegensatz, right? Which, again, Miller often translates as antithesis, but sometimes just as opposition, and sometimes as contradiction, right? And so Hegel here is saying, no, we have a real contradictory nature to substantiality, substantialitet, substantial being. Now, the substantial being of what? Of the separate moments. The separate moments have their own substantial beings, but they're also a substantial being together. And then he says a unity, the necessity brings a unity, the unity of the notion, in which the inconsistency and arbitrariness of their action is orderly disposed, literally ordnet. Now, we saw this was a term, Ordnung, the substantive form of ordnen, right, that was used earlier and was being said, this is not an Ordnung, right? Now we actually do have an Ordnung, a putting things into their proper places, a providing context, hierarchy, ordering, connection with each other, valorization, we could say. orderly disposes the inconsistency, right? And there it's this Inkonsistität, right? And the arbitrariness, Zufälligkeit. Now that's interesting because, again, we might have seen here, especially when we're talking about action, tat in this case, or tat rather, deed, we might have expected to see a different kind of arbitrariness being talked about, Willkürlichkeit, right? Something being up to the Willkür, the arbitrary will of a person. Instead, this is more like contingency, which would be like almost a literal translation of it. Fällig, right? Contingency comes from cadere, right? So the way things just happen to turn out is being given an orderly disposition, some sort of structure to it that provides intelligibility, that says, well, this isn't just one damn thing after another, to summarize. I forget whose view of history that was. And we could also say that about novels or plays or other sorts of things. One damn thing after another. That's a great way of understanding Zufälligkeit. So he says, here we go, the play of their actions receives its earnestness and worth. And here Miller is translating very, very close to the German earnestness, ernst, right? And worth, wert, could be translated as value as well. The play of actions, the Spiel ihrer Handlungen, right, is being given earnestness and worth. Earnestness, being given a kind of honesty, a kind of straightforwardness, a kind of here's what you get, and being assigned a value is another way of putting it. And it receives it in the actions themselves. It's, in the actions themselves is a little bit of a periphrastic translation. Now notice that we've got a connection here, right? We've got inconsistency and arbitrariness in the single action, the deed, and we have the play, the Spiel of actions, Handlungen, the play of the structure of actions, intentional actions, right? No longer just arbitrary. And these are being provided with this by that necessity. So that necessity is doing some work here, some important work. We go on. The content of the world of pictorial thought. Okay, so pictorial thought, yet another translation on Miller's part. Miller almost never uses the word that so many other people do use for Vorstellung, representation. Right? He's got all sorts of other things instead, picture language, pictorial thought. But you get what we're talking about here. There's some sort of connection to images that are universal but not yet universal enough, not like the concept, and can be placed at a sort of distance from ourselves. We can contemplate them. We can name them and talk about them. So the content of the world, notice again, we're talking about a world being created here of pictorial thought, freely unfolds itself in the middle term on its own account. The middle term, the Mitte, in the syllogism, in the connection between things. Gathering itself, he says, round. So here's the question. Okay, what is the middle point? In the past, it was supposed to be the minstrel, right? The person who composes or at least recites the epic, Homer, his followers and continuers. But that's not the middle term in this case. The middle term might also be the person who is in charge, right? In this case, it's not quite that, although there's nothing to prevent a hero from being in charge. Some heroes, this is a bit of a digression, some heroes in ancient Greece probably shouldn't be in charge. Agamemnon, Achilles, neither one of them are really great leaders when it comes down to it, right? Who would have been better to be put in charge? Mentor Odysseus. Odysseus is in charge of his men in the Odyssey, right? Who else? Jason, not a very good leader at all. Anyway, we've got the middle term. And what is the middle term in this case? He says the content gathers itself around the individuality of a hero. We're going to talk about the condition of this hero as it's depicted here in just a moment. But notice the individualitet of a hero, ein Held, right? Somebody who is representative of what's best, or at least part of what's best in that culture, what's admired, able to do things. What is at the extreme? Here's where it gets very, very interesting. And we have to engage in a little bit of speculation. The individuality that is in itself firmly established and actual is banished to its extreme and split into its moments which have not yet found and united itself. Right? Individuality, but not Individualität. Einzelheit. So Hegel is making a distinction here between what Miller is translating as individuality in both cases. Individualität, something that is also representative, that stands in the middle, and the thing that's placed over to the extreme, Einzelheit. He says, firmly established, in sich feste. It stays in its own condition, right? Actual, wirklich. Now that's really interesting. And those two things are connected together. Actuality, standing firm in its own condition, as opposed to the literary, imaginative, depicted hero. A little bit earlier in the morality section, Hegel has a lot of famous quips. Nobody's a hero to his own valet, right? Was one of them that's brought up in the morality section. He's taking that from somebody else as well. But when we see the reality of the hero, the Wirklichkeit, what they are in themselves as they're sitting at their table sipping coffee in their pajamas, not showered, not getting anything done, pissing away the day, we that's less heroic, isn't it? And, that's different than Achilles sulking in his tent because he's angry with Agamemnon, who he chose not to kill, right? That's the depicted hero. What was Achilles really like? Should we go to, watching movies? No, because those are Vorstellungen too, right? If Brad Pitt is Achilles at Troy, that's just a depiction, right? The real stinking, screwing things up Achilles is a individuality, an Einzelheit, who is actual, and we could go on and on and on with all this sort of stuff. What was the real Odysseus like? Assuming that Odysseus actually existed. Did it really take him 20 years to get home? Did he single-handedly, or with the aid of his son, dispatch all those suitors? Well, it's a great story, but the actuality might be a little less interesting. Or, for those of us who are into history, we do find this sort of stuff very interesting. Think about King Arthur, if we want to use a prime example of this, or any of his knights, and think about the way that they get depicted, right? So this is a bit of a tangent, but think about the, heraldry and, everything is so up and, above board and stuff like that. And Arthur's this kind of innocent guy who's forced into stuff. What we know about if there really was a King Arthur, he was probably some Romanized Briton who was fighting against Anglo-Saxon invaders. Things were not as black and white as it seemed to be. And maybe some of the knights existed like the knights that are depicted. Now think about the old-time movies where everybody's very chivalrous. And then think about darker, reworks. What do we call them? Gritty reboots. Are gritty reboots getting us to the real individuality? No, they're another kind of representation, aren't they? Because they're all gritty reboots in the same damn way, as we've realized. Gritty reboots are actually kind of boring these days because it's been done to death, hasn't it? All right, back to Hegel after that little digression. So this individuality is, he says, the one individual moment, the abstract, non-actual one. So now what's at the other extreme? Individuality, hero, what's on the other side? Is it God? Or the gods, as it was before? Is it necessity? The necessity that's up here already? Is it the minstrel himself? Well, Hegel says this. The one individual moment, the abstract, non-actual one, is necessity, which shares in the life of the middle term just as little. It's not there where the depiction of the hero is a living depiction. Necessity is where? On one side, as the necessity of the situation, perhaps, but also as the overarching necessity. And then who else do we have here? As the actual individual, the minstrel, who keeps himself outside of it and is lost in his performance. So the minstrel is not exactly the same as any old individuality, Einzelheit, that is actual, right? The minstrel is lost in the picturing, the Vorstellen, of the action, of all these other things, the play of actions, the contradictory substantiality. Let's go back to the hero, because we skipped over that a little bit. So what's distinctive about this hero? The hero who however in his strength and beauty, feels his life is broken and sorrowfully awaits an early death. Is that very heroic? Well, the hero does have strength. The hero does have beauty, and not beauty as in Achilles was such a good-looking guy, but beauty as in Schönheit, or the Greek kalon, nobility, fineness, admirability, honor, right? All of those sorts of things. Odysseus might be kind of a crafty bastard, but he's still Odysseus. He's still a cool guy, right? Ajax may be kind of, not the brightest guy and really stubborn and prone to bloodlust, but he's a tower among men on the fields of Troy, right? So we can go on and on. And every one of the Greek heroes, whether in epic or in tragedy, meets some sort of bad end, with the exception of Odysseus, right? So, anyway, going back to this, the minstrel keeps himself outside of it, lost in his performance. It says both extremes must draw nearer to the content. And now this is interesting. How are they doing that? One of them, necessity, has to fill itself with the content. Why? Because necessity is empty. The only necessity is a void, as we saw, a lera in the last paragraph. So that's going back to the previous paragraph. How does necessity go from being begrifflos, conceptless, to being the unity of the notion or concept through drawing near to the content? The other, he says, the language of the minstrel. Notice he doesn't just say the minstrel, the language of the minstrel, the use of that language must participate in it, in the content, and the content formerly left to itself must receive within it the certainty, Gewissheit, and the fixed character, Bestimmung, of the negative. We saw the negative being talked about in the previous paragraph, right? What do we have here? The pure power of the negative as the ultimate power over it and against which it can do nothing, right? The gods and the mortals both. And here we're talking about the certainty and fixed character of the negative. How does it get fixed character? In the Vorstellung, in the picturing, in the actions. So we have a lot going on here. And where are we going? Well, let's look at the next sentence of the previous paragraph. This higher language, that of tragedy. The higher language, who just had language? The minstrel. The minstrel is now going to become the tragedy writer.